Okay, good morning. We'll make a start. Welcome to day 3 of the Turn It Up conference. My name is Matthew Gordon. Before we kick off, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all meet. Now, of course, we are all meeting in different places. I live on the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung people, part of the Loddon River tribe of Central Victoria, and I pay my respects to them, their culture, their elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which you all sit. We are recording today's session, and for those who would like a copy, you will need to sign up to our newsletter, as all videos from the conference will be published via email newsletter. The link will be displayed on the screen now and will be posted to the chat. Our session today will be interactive and we would like to provide opportunities for you to post questions via the chat function. For those who want to keep the conversation going, please head on over to our conference Facebook page, facebook.com/turnitupconference, all one word. So, Cathy McGowan, I'd like to introduce you all, a great pleasure. Cathy is an Australian politician who was the independent MP for rural Victorian seat Indi from 2013 to 2019, famously beating incumbent Sophie Mirabella in what was regarded as a safe Liberal seat at the time. In 2004, Cathy was made an officer of the Order of Australia for services to the community through raising awareness of and stimulating debate about issues affecting women in regional and rural areas. Cathy is also the recipient of the Centenary Medal. Cathy, welcome to the Turn It Up conference. It's such a pleasure to have you here. And you're on mute. Quote of the year.
Yeah, no, sorry. Good morning, everybody. Hello, Matthew. Lovely to be here.
Fantastic. Now, Cathy, you're about to release a new book next month called Cathy Goes to Canberra, which we'll talk more about later on in today's session. You've been going to Canberra for quite a while now, and I'm keen to delve into the Voice for Indi story. But before we do that, tell me about your first experiences of taking community voice to Canberra.
So I live in country Victoria, and I come from a political family. We've always been involved in community politics. And the background to my early trips to Canberra is that I trained as a teacher, went to Monash University in the 70s, trained as a teacher, ended up teaching in Wangaratta, and I was looking for something more. And the local member of parliament at the time, a guy called Ewan Cameron, had advertised a vacancy for a research assistant, which I applied for and eventually got. So I was in my early or mid-20s, lived in Wangaratta, and then would travel up to Canberra when parliament sat. There were 2 staff in the office, me as the research assistant, and Margaret Deering was the secretary. So we ran that office for Ewan Cameron. He had won the seat, incidentally, from a National Party, a member of parliament, and that was the story. So for about 3 years, I worked during that period when Malcolm Fraser was the Prime Minister. So the Liberals were in government. Eventually, Bob Hawke won, and I had a little bit of experience of opposition and decided that there were many more things in the world that I wanted to do. So I resigned from that position and went travelling and eventually set myself up in my own consultancy business.
And you spent a bit of time taking, I guess, the issues of women to Canberra on a regular basis. And this, I guess, grounded your experience or foray into advocacy. Can you tell me a bit more about how that process began?
So once I'd finished in the early 20s of being the staffer, my consultancy business really worked across a broad range of community development areas. And in my spare time, I bought a farm and I got involved in an organisation called Australian Women in Agriculture, which was my passion and my interest, and it became my professional association. And I moved through the ranks of that organisation, starting out as secretary, and eventually over years became the vice president and president. And along that journey, I kept on saying to the women, well, we've got all these issues, we've got to go to Canberra and tell people about them. So that was a bit of a foreign experience. We hadn't normally done that. And so there was a little bit of an interlude somewhere in the middle there. I applied for and won a Churchill Fellowship. And I would really like to stress the importance of that sort of study opportunity that it gave me. And I went to Canada and I looked at what the Canadian women were doing in terms of advocacy. And they'd set up an organisation called Canadian Women in Agriculture. And while I was there, I was part of a gala dinner that they put on and had awarded the Canadian Woman in Agriculture Award for the year. But they also lobbied very effectively. So I was able to take some of those ideas, bring them back to Australia. And as part of Australian Women in Ag, every year at least once, but sometimes twice, we'd take a delegation to Canberra. In the end, there'd be 40 or 50 women. We'd pay our own way. We'd stay in a caravan park. We'd get one of the members of parliament to come and run a briefing session for us on how to be effective in our advocacy. We'd get passes. We'd ask, and there were quite a few women in parliament who were very helpful with our work. And then we'd prepare briefing papers, and then we'd all go and see our members of parliament and talk about the issues which we wanted attention to. So that worked for a good 10, 12 years. So, and we did have some wins on some topics. There was a particular time there in the 1990s where the government wanted to introduce an asset test or expand the asset test for, I don't know, maybe it was family allowance to include the family farm. And we argued against it and got the rule changed. But we learned a fundamental lesson that the next year, the government reintroduced that bill as part of their budget changes, and we went back to what we were. So we won a short-term victory, but lost the battle.
What were some of the lessons that you learned in those sort of early years around, the role of, you as the sort of the facilitator, if you will, the person who brings community voice into the halls of power?
So it was just fascinating because over a period of time, we grew from a small group of people going to a large number. And what I learned was that women, but I think people, were absolutely fascinated by how Parliament worked, and they had really little knowledge about it, but they were desperately keen to better understand how to use our democratic system and our political system to fix things up, because all of us had things that we needed fixing up. And there was a level of dissatisfaction with going through the main parties. That was one. The second thing I learned was people really loved being in Canberra, and we got better at it. So we'd get all dolled up and, wear our best clothes and our high heel shoes and the click of our high heel shoes on those Canberra floors. And then we took advice from people and said, well, how do we do this better? And they said, well, maybe have a dinner the night before and invite people to come to the dinner. So we ended up booking out the Brassy, hosting a dinner, and we got braver in who we would invite to the dinner. Initially, it was just our friends, maybe people in the bureaucracy, but then we'd invite parliamentary secretaries, we'd invite ministers, and they came. So us women hosted these pre-dinner lobbying events, which, industry has always done, but community groups have never done, and we women had never done. And we could do all this work pre the formal lobbying, so that when we met for the formal meetings the next day, lots of things got sorted out. So we actually learned how to be effective lobbyists over that period of time, and we grew in confidence. So it was good fun. And the other thing that I learned is that people are open to learning. So you couldn't assume people knew. I'd known because I'd had that work experience. But once we got, say, a friendly member of parliament to come and do a lobby session, there's one famous story of Amanda Vanstone hosting a breakfast for us in the staff dining room at Parliament House, her and Judith Troth, actually, both Liberal women, and explaining to us what they liked about a lobbying activity. And there was 25 of us women sitting around the breakfast table, and we were just sucking it up how to do this. So what I learned is that you can learn, and that experiential learning is what works, because the women left really confident, and afterwards they could go and organise their own deputations. They didn't have to do it through Australian Women in Ag.
And it's an interesting challenge, I think, that we still face. One, the dissatisfaction of the sort of the political and parliamentary processes, or the perceived dissatisfaction of that. And, one of the solutions here is not only to sort of inform people on how this stuff works, but to kind of take them through the direct experience. And it seems to me that we struggle to find the time or the resources to create those sorts of experiences. I want to kind of now sort of flip the kind of the conversation to a few years later with the Voice for Indi. Now, as a community engagement practitioner, the Voice for Indi is one of the most remarkable community engagement stories I think I've ever heard, and is an enormous inspiration. It sort of reminds me, I mean, it's this kind of ultimate expression of people power on one level. And it does remind me of Margaret Mead's statement that you should never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world, because in fact it's the only thing that ever has. How does the Voice for Indi story kind of relate to Margaret Mead's famous statement?
Yeah. So there was 12 of us who started. So that was a small group of people. You've got to be bold and you've got to be courageous. And I think that's the fundamental thing about what we did in Northeast Victoria with Voices for Indi. It was a really scary thing to take on the Liberal Party. Many of us had professional jobs. We relied on government funding. We were not naive about the consequences that would come to us for being naughty. And we were naughty in that ultimate sense. But the Margaret Mead thing gave us courage. And I would like to give everybody listening today that you don't have to feel overwhelmed by the system. You know, a small group of people, well organised, not naive, and having a clear vision and purpose can do things. And that's what we were. We were clever people who lived in the country. And what I think really gave us the motivation was the sense that we didn't like our political representation. Or many of us, like clearly lots of people did, but we didn't. And our seat was what was called a safe seat. You've mentioned that, Matthew. And we thought we've got to make it marginal. And we'd watched what's happened in New England with Tony Windsor. And we'd seen the changes that can happen when a seat becomes marginal and competitive. So that was our ambition, to see if we could at least make the seat competitive so that we could start, getting some intention. When we stood it out, wasn't to win the seat. That was seen too far away. But we really did think we could make it competitive by being organised. And we thought we ought to give it a go, because we'd had 3 elections and the current incumbent, her vote was going down. And we were hating it, hating the decisions that she was making on our behalf even more. And I think what really brought it to a fore for me was when the national apology was made by Kevin Rudd. Our Member of Parliament abstained. And there was a demonstration in Wangaratta. And I can't remember how many people turned up, but a large number of us did. And we looked around and we looked at each other and said, if we don't do something, this is going to continue. And if you've got to take responsibility, because the world is changed by those who turn up. So I think there was an impetus to change, as well as that sense of that we could, and that we ought to give it a go, because that was our responsibility.
Now, the goal of making a seat marginal, there's probably a couple of solutions or strategies that you might take to this. You selected a particular strategy, which I'd like to kind of delve into. But when you're looking at the opportunity, what did you see as the options to making it marginal, and why did you take the option you took?
Well, I think in retrospect, I can talk about what I know now about marginal seats. At the time, we didn't know it. We were just going to try and our intention at the beginning was to engage the community in a discussion about politics, because we thought if people could engage about politics, they would want something better for themselves. We thought eventually we did need a candidate, but at the first instance, and we did those famous kitchen table conversations to get conversations started. But it was, let's see if we can generate enough interest. And we had enough issues that we could focus people's attention on. So there was the unpopular member. We also had a really bad train line that failed to work. We had very little mobile, if any, mobile phone country coverage outside the main large areas. And we had no internet broadband coverage at all. And there was no jobs. The young people were going away. So there were really pressing issues that needed attention. And none of these were on the agenda of the major parties. So we were able to galvanise around issues as well as the individual. But if I look back, what I know that works, and I've watched it really closely now for a number of years, you've got to have something broken in your electorate. If everything is going well, if you've got if you're safe seat and you've got an okay member of parliament who people don't dislike, who turns up, it's really hard to shift them. That incumbency is really, really strong. But people were very dissatisfied with our member of parliament. The second thing we had is a group of people who had skills and were able to organise. And most of us were community development people. Many of us had done leadership courses, which I'm sure people listening today have done. So we knew about leadership and we knew about change and we had good theory. So it wasn't like, we knew stuff. So that you need to have a team of people who can reach out to others and do that. What we ended up doing was train the trainer and build a community movement. So you've got to have skill. And the third thing is you've got to actually be politically savvy. You don't win if you're politically naive, because you're against and I don't think you can ever underestimate the power of the political parties. They're professional winners of campaigns, and they know how to do it. So you're not going to win by just being do good, hopeful, optimistic people. You've actually got to outplay their strategy. And it wasn't only because I had been a member of parliament, but the team of us, we'd all been interested in politics for a long time and we'd studied it. So between the 12 that later grew to, I think, about 20, we had some very clever political brains who had, one, ways of engaging with community. Two, we had a group of young people who knew about social media. A couple of them had been to America and watched Obama's campaigns, and they knew about Nation Builder, which was the platform that we were able to use. There were very good community social media campaigners. And we had other people who understood about political preferences. So we were eventually able to get the preferences of the National Party. Because of the coalition agreement, the National Party weren't running, and they were really annoyed that they couldn't have their say. So eventually Ken Jasper came out and brought with him a very large number of political preferences. So lining those preferences up, again, made a really big difference in the end. So the team of people had the skill, but it's like any project. Anybody listening today knows about project design and knows how to get things done. We wanted to see if we could bring that skill of community development and engagement into the political sphere. And we were delighted. Not only could we do it, but then we won.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it was just absolute excitement the moment the second count came in to confirm that this was a win for you and your team. You mentioned the kitchen table conversations as a model. Could you just maybe explain, for those who in the audience, they might not know the story behind the kitchen table conversation model, and as a community engagement technique, why it was so powerful in kickstarting, I suppose, this movement that you mentioned?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. So there's a wonderful organisation in Victoria called the Victorian Women's Trust, and I just dip my lid to them. And a number of the women that were part of my team had also been members of Australian Women in Agriculture. So they'd been to Canberra with us, and we'd done things together. And many of us women in ag had been part of a process pioneered by the Victorian Women's Trust called Purple Sage, which was in the 1990s, was part of a community conversation around politicisation. And some people accredit it with helping get rid of the Premier of Victoria in the 1990s. And they also ran another refinement of that process called Watermark. So we'd been part of that, sitting around the kitchen table with a small group of people, facilitated discussions with a kit, which explained how to have the discussion. And the discussions happened over a period of time. So we adapted that model, the kitchen table conversation model, that the Victorian Women's Trust had already pioneered and we had already experienced. And we knew the power, the transformative power of sitting down with a small group of people, having serious conversations about issues. And you didn't actually have to you agree with people. There was a whole lot of openness about the conversation. But also one of the skills with the kitchen table conversations was the collation of data. Now, we were really, really blessed in our early days because Mary Crooks is the convener of the Victorian Women's Trust. So she came up and she did a briefing to the people, the core group. I mean, she came up more than once, I think, and provided guidance to how we could adapt that process. And I know the Victorian Women's Trust has gone on and used that process somewhere else. So full credit to them. And we in Indi were able to adapt it to suit our community's peculiarities. So how it worked in process was that in sort of, I'd say, February 2013, the election was in August or September 2013, we publicised meetings and put ads in the paper, put social media out, calling for people who'd be interested to be briefed about these kitchen table conversation processes. And it was sponsored by Voices for Indi. And we held 6 of them in each of the main towns. And initially there were 6 or 7 people turned up. One particular meeting in Wangaratta, I think there was 35 to 40 people turned up. And as part of the briefing, and I was the project leader, so I would explain the process, then we would actually do a kitchen table conversation as part of the briefing. And the really interesting thing about this particular Wangaratta event was the excitement and the energy of those people who turned up was just palatable. Not only to do the process, but they said, well, we've got to have a candidate. We've got to run a candidate. We can't just talk about this, hoping a candidate will come out of the ether. We've actually got to do this and follow it through. And at that stage, I hadn't actually made up my mind to be a candidate, but we said, yes, we've all got to find it. So go out and find a candidate, which actually was a harder job than we thought. But once the 12 of us had got the excitement that came from the briefings, we knew we were onto something. Anyhow, I think we had 56 hosts. No, that's probably too many. But anyhow, maybe 150 actual people took part in the conversations. So while it wasn't big numbers, what it really did was created a community conversation. And we knew that the people who were involved in the kitchen table conversations were all involved in their community. So it began the snowball effect of people started talking about, there's a group of people here, they're really keen, they've got this great process. I was involved in one of these. There's going to be another one next week. Are you interested? Do you want to come? And when we eventually got the campaign underway, which was perhaps in May, June, July 2013, we had a base that we could build on. And many of those hosts took on fundraising activities and serious volunteer activities as part of the campaign. So they provided the foundation structure to build a much larger movement.
It sounds very much like a deliberative engagement approach, steeped in dialogue, driven by community, representative through just sheer numbers. I'm curious about, you're having a lot of conversations, lots of hosts, inviting their friends, family, neighbours around for a cup of tea and having a conversation about what makes for a great community. What's important in political representation? What are the issues that you'd like to see represented in Canberra and so forth? How do you take that volume of feedback and information and report it back in a kind of a useful way, I suppose, to the community to kind of say, look, I see this process. I trust this process. I can relate to it. What was I'm kind of curious about that because, 150, 200 people coming together in a period of time, lots of different voices, kind of making that a cohesive kind of report, I think would be challenging, particularly in those timeframes. We're going from within a 4 or 5 month period of a safe seat to a marginal seat, without a political apparatus. I'm just curious about how you crunch all those without the resources, without the timeline.
Yeah, again, this is where the experience of the Victorian Women's Trust was really useful. Mary Crooks came up and guided a process. So we had a room full of everything, and every report was read by 2 or 3 eyes. We had butcher's paper around the room, and we collected the main themes. But the real skill of it, so that it was a big task, and I think it took us a whole weekend of lots and lots of people going through stuff. But what we ended up doing was this report called A Voice for Indi. But we made sure, you can't actually read it, but every single comment got published. And we resisted the temptation to make comment about comment. So we actually pulled out we had three main questions. What makes a community strong? What are the best things about living in Indi? What are the particular issues which concern you? What about good political representation? And we put every single word into that report. So we didn't try and analyse it. And so it was a really useful thing. We began by saying we're going to represent. We're not going to interpret, and we're not going to prioritise, which was a lovely place to be. So we didn't do that. We actually reported and reflected back to the community. And that in itself was useful, but it wasn't the change movement. That just showed people that we were honest and we did what we said we were going to do. We listened, reported, and we gave them back the report. The next stage of the process, I think, really, really built the movement. So having done the kitchen table conversations and got the report, and people could see that we were serious and we had a product, we then set up community hubs. And the community hubs were built on the neighbourhood house idea. So we hired venues in each town, sometimes shop fronts, sometimes houses. And I think we had 4 in that first term. We maybe had 13 in the second election and a lot more in Helen Haynes's election. And the hubs operated for about 2 months before the election, and they were staffed by volunteers. They had a coordinator. There was always food. There was always activity. And anybody could drop in off the street and visit the hub, and there'd be a list of jobs on the wall, and there'd be weekly meetings. So depending on people's interests, they could get really involved in the community hub. So we actually, while the kitchen table conversations were really important for setting a foundation, the hubs created the movement. And hundreds and hundreds of people came to the hubs who had nothing to do with kitchen table conversations, didn't care about politics. And one of the very useful ideas came quite early in the piece was that people came to the hubs wanting to do things. And we weren't really clever about, well, what could they do? We knew we needed to do things. So we workshopped the idea of a spectrum of activity from, putting up core flutes to door knocking to how to vote cards. And that was useful, but it didn't quite engage with most of the people who were coming in the door. And there's a guy called John Brown, who's a winery, owns Brown Brothers Winery in Wangaratta. And John was telling me about when he'd been in Malaysia at the election he'd seen, and he said, you go into any village and there's flags everywhere, and the flags are coloured according to the parties. And because there's maybe a low literacy rate, the colour is the connection. And we went, bingo. So orange became the colour, and the flags and the merchandise associated with orange became the activity. And so we morphed into the neighbourhood houses, and there was a group called the Indi Makers. And the Indi Makers came in with their sewing machines, they came in with their hammers and nails, and they started making things. They made flags, they knitted things, they made covers for dogs, but mostly made flags, and then they made the A-frames that we could put outside. And this was all community work. And as you can imagine, I think, Matthew, as this got underway, those hubs became really busy, 50, 60 people a day, and there'd be orange, pumpkin soup for lunch. And at night times, people said, well, I want to go out, I don't really want to go and door knock. It's terrible, I'm really scared. And we said, okay, well, we'll run a class for you on door knocking. So we'd bring in somebody who was really good, a bit of an actor and a bit of a human person with comedy, and they'd run a half-hour role play on how to door knock. And that really took off. So every Friday night we had these classes in the hubs. We had door knocking, we had how to hand out a how to vote card, we had the rules about putting up core flutes, whatever it was we had a really good role play about how preferences worked. So the hubs, and then I'd turn up and make a rah-rah speech, and I'd go from Wodonga to Wangaratta to Benalla to Mansfield and do my bit. And the volunteers would all, and that grew and grew and grew, so that by, the 2 or 3 weeks when pre-polling started before the election, there was just this absolute vibe around the hubs. And the hubs really worked on that neighbourhood house principle of come in and there's warmth and affection and coordination. And then we had really good communication between the hub coordinators and the sort of central organising team, which was the 12 that grew to about 20. So we made sure that those links were strong, and the thing was very much decentralised. If you could begin to imagine that, I hope it makes some sense.
Absolutely. And I think it's just these techniques of managing an engagement project of this scale, I think is useful to those in the audience today. I'd like to kind of shift a little bit forward. So Cathy, you go to Canberra, you're now the community engagement MP, and you've got, the community behind you with all their issues, all their questions. What do you do next? How do you continue to share control with the community, which is often a very nerve-wracking experience for those people in positions of power? And you are now in a position of power. You have your Canberra office, you have your resources, you have your ability to walk down the hall and talk to any minister or even the Prime Minister if need be about these issues. How do you maintain that ability to keep the community connected now that you're on the other side?
So you've put your finger on what was a huge challenge, Matthew. So I'll go back to the Voices for Indi. It was never about sharing control. It was about empowering people to be engaged in democracy and people taking personal and group responsibility for their own decisions. So we never, ever said it was about handing over to somebody control or to a group. And again, that was why the report we did on the Voices for Indi Kitchen Table Conversations report, we just said, we're going to reflect back to you what you've said. We're not owning this. You're not giving it to us. You still own all this information. This is not ours. This is yours. So when I was a Member of Parliament, I never had a sense that the community, I had a very strong sense that I was a community representative and a community Member of Parliament. And if I was going to do my job well, to represent the community, and the key word for me was always represent, then I had to engage with the community. So that was my task. But I also said to the community, if you want to get things done, you've got to be actively engaged in this. So a couple of things happened. One is I had a process of engagement, and that was particularly strong around the budget, which came down. The 2014 horrific budget opened it up. And so I consulted widely with the community about how would I vote about this budget? Would I vote with the government or not? And basically spoke to hundreds and hundreds of people. And in the end, in 2018, my last budget, we had over 1,000 people actively engaged in the budget, opinions about the budget, which I then incorporated into my budget speech. But the decision in 2013, the community I spoke to clearly wanted me to vote with the government, but to make sure that the government understood that they didn't like this stuff. They didn't want me to reject the budget. So that was easy. I thought, oh, I can do this. I can understand the role here of representing. However, I couldn't do everything. Like, it was a really busy job. So in our office, we had a strategic plan around what I had decided through the conversations were the main issues. And they were the mobile phone coverage and NBN, fixing the train up, representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, giving voice to young people, and the arts. So we had a strategic plan around the activities that I was actually going to try and make a difference around. And then there was everything else. So with everything else, I said to the community, guys, this is your issue, you've got to get organised. And initially that was like, oh, and I said, yes, well, I can't do it for you. You go and work out what you want done. And again, we took the learnings from the early days with Australian Women in Ag and the early days from the hubs about learning. So, and one of the really key groups at this stage was a group of people really keen about the environment. And if you can remember back when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, the very first bits of legislation he passed was getting rid of the carbon trading scheme, which clearly I voted against, but and the community came to me and said, well, what are you going to do about that? And I said, well, there's nothing else. I've voted. Government is not going to move. I can't do anything else. I said, you need to do something. Let's think globally and act locally. And that group said, but we don't know what to do. And I said, well, okay, you come to Canberra and I'll do with you what we did with the Australian Women in Ag. I'll introduce you around, you can meet people. And that's what happened. This group of people came up, and the long and the short of it was that they ended up setting up totally renewable Yakandanda, a tiny little community, 600 people. And they said, okay, well, we're going to see if we can do this. They set an audacious goal that by 2022, the balance between imported and locally produced electricity would be equal, and they'd create a community movement. And that's what they did. So I became their representative in Canberra. I'd make speeches about it, and I'd facilitate opportunities for them to come up and meet with people. And when they asked me to do specific things, I would. But that community activity, which was totally renewable, Indi, it became, and now they've set up their own power company called Indigo Power, and they're buying and selling electricity and generating it. And they've got community hubs all over northeast Victoria, grew out of that model. And that once I'd understood that there were two things. One, I had to represent, and I had to talk to my community to represent, but I was not their servant around every single issue, that they actually had to get organised. And so after a period of time, we had these action groups. We had Totally Renewable Indi, we had the rail action group, Border Rail action group, we had Indi Telecommunications action group, we had a refugee action group. So we had these electorate-wide action groups that worked out what they wanted. And sure, I could represent them, but they all came to Canberra, and we had this volunteer program where people would come up Monday morning. We'd organise billets, so it wasn't expensive for them to do it. And they stayed for 4 days working in my office, learning how my office works, so that they were then empowered, if you want, to go and do their own business. So that's sort of how it worked out. And it became a really busy thing, managing the community. But I just have to say, it was the joy of my job. I just loved it.
I think it's such a fantastic evolution, I suppose, in the story, of keeping community engagement central, to the work of local politics in Canberra. I want to we've got about 15 minutes left. I want to just give people a couple of opportunities. One, we'll take some questions from the floor shortly. We've got a couple of questions coming in through the Q&A function, so keep those questions coming in. I'm also happy to give people just a minute to stretch, maybe visit the bathroom, top up their tea or coffee. And whilst we do that, I was hoping, Cathy, maybe you could pitch your latest endeavour, the book, Cathy Goes to Canberra.
Well, thank you. Yes, so this is an advertisement. The book's coming out on the 1st of November, and it's my COVID project. It was in the making for a long time, and I kept really good journals while I was a member of Parliament. And there was a team of people who helped me do the book too, I need to acknowledge. But I really wanted to inspire regional people to understand that it's possible to change a member of Parliament, one. And two, I wanted to say to good regional women, anybody really, but I'm focusing on regional women because there's so few of us in Parliament, you too can be bold and courageous and do what I did. It's possible. And three, I wanted to say, and it makes a huge difference to yourself, to your community, and I think to Australia, if more people would step up for independent politics. And the key statistic is this. In Indi, in 2013, we knew that we needed 1 in every 4 voters to change their vote. And so that was the task we had. When we set about campaigning, we said to every single volunteer, you need to get 1 in every 4 of your network to vote 1 for Cathy. So if I had 100,000 votes, we needed 25,000 first preferences, and then we could get the other preferences. So that was a really clear statistic, and it worked. We got 1 in 4 votes, and then the preferences worked our way so that I was able to get ahead of the Liberal candidate. So if that worked in this little community of northeast Victoria, it's possible for Australia, really and truly possible. If 1 in 4 people change their vote in an organised, coordinated activity, and particularly in regional seats where people are unhappy with their representation and there's no shortage of them, this could happen. So that's the point of the book. I want people to read it and go, whoa, this is possible. So it's a light read. It's not heavy on politics, but it is a story of how that me, if you want, was part of a community movement. And I'm looking forward to the Voices for Indi people. They're currently working on their own book to tell their story of the actual community movement side of it. And with a bit of luck, that'll be out next year. So these books will work in tandem. So that's probably the spiel, Matt. And thank you very
Cathy.
much for putting the link up.
No worries. And we've posted the link in the chat function as well. So click on that. The book comes out in November, and I look forward to reading it. We were talking about the community engagement MP and specifically the kind of the role that we can have in not only representing views of the community, but really kind of clarifying that role of facilitating community action. And in there, you talked about you engaged over 1,000 people in the budget. Mind you, it was a bloody dreadful budget. But having said that, it will be people on today's call who every year need to engage their community on the budget. And that's quite a challenge. I'm kind of curious about if you could just tell me a little bit more about that role of facilitator and how you then applied that kind of role of facilitator in kind of making room or space for the next candidate for the seat of Indi.
So I'll just talk about the budget consultation. So first, and I'll come back to Helen Haynes second. So as I told at the beginning of the story, there was young people who were particularly, through their social media, were particularly influential in getting me elected. And I made a promise and a commitment to them that I would give preferential representation to young people. Given a choice, I would listen to them. And so all the time I was a member of parliament, I worked extraordinarily hard, and every bit of my imagination, how can I get young people to participate in democracy and renew their trust? So obviously when we had volunteers come to Canberra, we had lots of young, particularly students doing their degrees or early researchers, they would come. And we had schools come. So over 5,000 school kids came and visited Parliament. And I went and spoke to them and inspired them and told them how important it was. So on that final 2019, but working up to it, the young people had not been keen to input into the budget. So we had a bit of a group meeting and so what do we need to do? And after much discussion, we came up with this idea, which we trialled in 2017, maybe 16 first, where we put on budget breakfasts. And I would pay for the breakfast. We'd have one in Wodonga, one in Wangaratta, one in Benalla, one in Mansfield. I would pay for the breakfast. They would be before school from 7 till 8:30. And we'd put on transport if needed. And we'd put the word out to all the young people that we'd been working with, the kids that had come to Canberra, the volunteers, come to the budget breakfasts and you'll get it, we'll workshop it. And so that's actually what happened. And, 20 or 30 people, young people would turn up, mostly before school or if they were otherwise engaged. And I just wanted to say it was so, humbling is a word, but I don't know. So it's fundamentally changed me being at those budget breakfasts. So clearly I went to listen to these young people so I could represent them. And I was able to do that. But what actually opened up for me was their lives. And just a little bit of a story about in one session in Wodonga, the local TAFE teacher who we'd been working with brought her TAFE students to the breakfast, 5 or 6 of them. And many of these were carers. So they were young people at TAFE and they were also caring for somebody in their family. And I had never understood the role of young people as carers. And here they were at TAFE, many of them were on farms. So they got up early, looked after their disabled brother or sister or their mother or their father or whoever they were caring for, got themselves to TAFE, got themselves to my breakfast, then got themselves to TAFE. And then most of them had part-time work as well. So I just wanted to tell that story because you do this thing because you're thinking you're doing a representation. But if you make the effort to actually go out and meet as a member of parliament and all members of parliament would tell this, you change and you become much better at your job because you're not so judgmental. But also it gave me access to these young people and say, you come to Canberra and we can talk about caring, or we can talk about whatever the issues that they were involved in. So anyhow, those breakfasts were particularly powerful. But also as a politician, they gave me access to those young people's networks, all of whom were voters. So that was really powerful. But we also did, we used social media a lot. We had actual survey forms that people could fill in. So we used sort of every single technique that we could come up with. And again, the data was horrendous that would come through. And I could only use a little bit of it in my budget speech. But what was very useful to me was the data was useful, but what was more useful was access to people's names and contacts so that I could actually reach out into their lives and they could become part of the Orange team, which many of them wanted to do. So they could actually then take action on their own issues.
Cathy, I feel like we should do another session. There's so much more to cover. I wanted to get to the mobile phone tower piece. I wanted to get to so many other things, but we're gonna go to some questions that are coming through from the audience. But I just wanted to sum up that last piece. It's amazing a measure of engagement that we often forget to report is how has this engagement process not only changed or influenced or informed a community, but how has it changed and informed and influenced the engager? Because certainly that is just as important, particularly if the engager is holding office. And I want to maybe stress the need in our design, evaluation, monitoring of kind of community engagement activities to kind of think of that maybe as the KPI, that, you know, we're all sponges, and this is an opportunity to kind of fill our sponge with the expertise, the experience and the wisdom of members of the community. Now, there's some questions coming through. I'm going to try and work through these. Maybe if we could allow just sort of a 30 to 45-second response on each of these, Cathy, that'd be great. The first one's from Gayatri. As someone who works in Parliament here in Victoria, what are some tips, suggestions for what institutions as conservative and as traditional as Parliament can do to make the experience of engaging with our systems and processes more accessible and welcoming and indeed less intimidating?
I don't know the Victorian Parliament situation well, but two things about the Canberra situation. One is that there's a Parliamentary Education Office. Does Victoria have that? So the PEO was fantastic. So I would get my schools to come up and do the PEO program. And it was liberating. And I would make sure that I went and met every one of those school groups. So the role of the PEO, and I tried to get Canberra to open it up outside school groups to adults. I thought, if I could have just got community groups in my electorate to come to Canberra and do the PEO course, Parliamentary Education Office course that they did for the schools, it would have been fantastic. I mean, I ran out of energy in the end. That was too hard and there was not enough money in the system to do. But the thing that we most need to do is show people how our parliamentary system works. And we've got to have that education built in to the institutions. Now, clearly I did that. My background is education, but I'd love to see Parliament do it. And not to say it doesn't do it. I know Victorian Parliament's got this fantastic Young People to Parliament program, and they do that reach out. So more of that, I think, would be really important.
I mean, there are chambers of decision-making all through our country, in every local community, local government. Certainly that could be a starting point to even understand the role of democratic process. Another one from anonymous attendee, fantastic story. It sounds like you were never prepared to be an MP. Perhaps you were, I'm not sure. How did you yourself prepare yourself to understand how Parliament works when you were elected? I mean, you've been going to Canberra for a while, you've been on the other side of the fence, but I suppose what was your learning curve like?
Hey, Anonymous, you got to read the book. There's a whole chapter on it.
There you go.
You should spot on. It was just an absolute personal journey. I had to leave one life and pick up another, and I was really cross about it. I mean, I thought we could make the seat marginal. We had no hope of winning. So it was a shock and a surprise. So but that's why I wanted to write the book, because people, if we actually did this with deliberation and with purpose and intention, oh my God, we would have so much, we could do so much rather than by accident, which is what I was. So I really want people to become members of parliament because their community want them there. And it's a little bit like the Helen Haynes story.
Let's pick up on that actually, by the way. Yeah.
Helen's got a PhD in, she's a midwife, and she's got a PhD in with disease. So people started saying, well, Helen, you'd be a good MP. You know, you're a leader. You speak really well. You're competent. You know what you're talking about. So people started tapping her on the shoulder. And it was a bit of a journey for her to actually step up. But I think if we started looking around to see who in our community have got the skills we want, they're not going to say me, me, me. The community is going to say you, and we'll get behind you because we think you're competent and clever and good. And you don't have to do it forever. You know, 6 years is a good term, you know, and then we'll change it over. So I think there's lots in the book about that approach, but it needs to be by design. And you need to be looking around your community now and saying, in the election next year, who do we really want? Who could run as an independent? And like, let me say, Wentworth did it really well with Karen Phelps, you know, clearly a standout. And Zali Steggall, clearly a standout. So the community found these people, said, we'll get behind you. We want you there. And yeah, go to it. Go for it.
And I think it's such an exceptional outcome for the community of Indi. I don't know of any other seat that's successfully handed on an independent baton from one individual to another. You know, thereby kind of breaking, you know, the need for the kind of the rock star candidate, the cult of personality in the independent seat. You know, this is genuinely a community-led seat now. One final quick question. We've spoken a lot about engaging young people to participate in these sorts of ventures. What about old people?
So the old people came naturally, I have to say. There was a 56 and over, they flocked to the campaign, and many of them because they had more time. It was the middle group, the families in the middle years of their life who found it harder to find the time. But it wasn't hard to represent them. They were articulate, so they would come to me. So yeah, the old people were there in large numbers. Older people were there in very large numbers. And the younger people were much harder to get engaged in politics. And I think the older people were there because they have much more a tradition of that sense of responsibility and community obligation and community interdependence, and they really get our system. So yeah, they from my perspective, and perhaps because I'm part of that, I'm a baby boomer, that group was naturally there for me.
Cathy, we're going to have to wrap it up there. I wanted to say thank you so much for making the time today. It was just awesome to have you in today's session. Thank you. We're going to, lots of lessons have come out of today's session, and we'll sure to be sharing today's video recording. For those who are still on the call, look forward to our next session, which starts in just a few minutes. What is the future of engagement in a COVID normal world? So hang in there, stick on to our next session at 10 o'clock. But on behalf of everyone in the call, thank you very much, Cathy, for sharing your insights. It's been absolutely refreshing and fantastic, and we've really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody.